Welcome to the People's Forum. Welcome back, America. Welcome back. I'm your host, KWAME INNIS with the People's Forum, and we're going back to the blackboard. We have the Dean of Data. I just made that up for him, Mr. Shawn D. Rochester. He's your engineer's favorite engineer. We're going to get back into his book, The Black Tax. We're going to cover a lot of statistical data, let us know exactly what's been happening over the last 400 years. So without further ado, welcome, Mr. Shawn D. Rochester.
Well, man, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me back.
I'm following you. I'm like your shadow now. I'm like your shadow. Been immersed in your book for, I guess, the last 2 months, and you have opened up a lot of windows, shown the world a lot of light in terms of this paradigm, this thing that's been occurring, at least all over the world, but at least in this Western Hemisphere that we deal with, is not something by accident. There's actually a hand or a series of hands, and there's a system in place that affects this entire thing. So this is not just because one certain group of people are just lazy or misfortunate.
Yeah, the essence of the book is to look at, the financial cost of discrimination. And to look at to what extent does discrimination exist, to what extent is research talking about that. As we've talked about before, when we talk about discrimination, it's often seen through a lens of the injustice or the morality, but I wanted to look at it from a lens of what's the economic impact, right? And more importantly, what does research say about it? And it really elevates the level of discourse around it. A lot of our conversations are very qualitative. And qualitative discussions, we can just agree to disagree.
Exactly.
And that can be really problematic.
And like you said, a lot of this discussion comes with emotions. It comes with shame. It comes with blame. It comes with, I didn't get any help, or it wasn't me. I wasn't around then, or why can't you guys seem to get it together? But you did a very, very acute job at bringing all of those things out and shining a light on it. And we appreciate you for it.
Thank you. Thank you. I think there's a place for emotion and all of the feelings associated with it, absolutely. But there's also a place for what is it that we are emoting about? What transpired or didn't transpire? What was the effect to the best of our knowledge and understanding? Was there economic impact? Right? Was there cost to black people? Were there investments being made in one group of people and not another group of people? Do those investments have anything to do with what we're observing right now? And it's important to have that information just kind of laid out. And it really speaks for itself. You don't have to be hyperbolic. You don't have to be inflammatory or anything else. But just to lay it out in place to elevate the level of discussion associated with a topic that people generally don't want to talk about.
There's been discussions even at the UN and different groups have brought the idea of reparations to the UN. And I believe your book gives strength or gives a foundation to reparations and what they actually could mean or should mean. How do you feel about that? I mean, having spoken at the UN yourself.
Yeah, I think there's the notion of how do we solve the current big problems now, and doing that through the creation of jobs and businesses in the black community and making investments in black financial institutions, primarily driven by deposits, but there's also other investments that we can make. And there's the conversation around why we should do that. Because a lot of people don't see the problem that we see. And it's very hard to work with folks if they don't see the problem or if they think you're the problem, right? We've talked about this. So you've got understanding what is the size, scope, enormity of the situation we're in, and what can you do from now, right now. That's a conversation about that framework that I talk about, which is called PhD, purchase, hire, and deposit, ways that create jobs, create businesses, and expand businesses in the black community, right? The issue of reparations is far more massive than that. And I think there's a lot of discussion that needs to happen with it. Firstly, people never intelligently talk about what the size of that would be.
The size and scope of those numbers.
Yeah, you know what I mean? That's an important thing to like know and understand. Your second part is how would you even get public opinion in that direction to even consider, right? Something like that. You know, another piece of it is if you just fast forward it, right? Just fast forward straight to you solve all those things and people are like, yep, let's do it. And they did it. We don't also have an infrastructure to retain it.
Exactly.
Right?
I believe as fast as it goes into that funnel,
it flows right
it's
through.
going to flow
It's
right
going to flow right through. And that's part of the problem. So when you talk about PhD, what it's doing is really putting an infrastructure in place, right? When I say infrastructure, I mean we don't have the financial, you know, banks and institutions, right, from a depository, commercial, non-depository standpoint. We don't have the industries in place at the level that it should have been, right? There's lots of historical information that limited that. I talk about those things in the book. We really don't have a lot of those things in place. And where it shows up is, you know, you have these studies and conversations, and people talk about like the velocity of money, how long it stays in communities.
Yes.
And, you know, it stays in this community 70 days, in that community 30 days, in that community, you know, X number of months.
10 times, 12 times, 5 times.
Right. But for us, it's just, it only stays, you know, a day or this or that or whatever the numbers are. By the way, people never tell you how to calculate those things. But what they're describing is the lack of PhD that's in the community. We don't have the infrastructure for it to stay
Like
within
you said,
it.
we're missing 1.5 million jobs with staff.
Right, 1.4 million jobs with staff, which is massive, right? We don't have in place. So you know, is reparations a critical and important aspect of all this? Yeah, clearly. When is that going to happen? Right?
Well, every stimulus package, whether we call it reparations or we call it a bailout for the car companies or we call it a GI Bill, when those stimulus packages come, they benefit the nation, you know, at large, as a whole.
Yeah, the connotation is just massively different in terms of what people understand. Now you're getting into bias in perceptions, right? Because when resources are distributed, they're viewed as, you know, helping people and hand ups and all that kind of stuff for one group. When they appear to be targeted to another group, it's seen as something more nefarious. It's seen as, you know, all these kind of welfare-like things that don't really add a whole lot of value, even though the impacts may be similar. So you get into a lot of the nomenclature and associated with it. My thing with that is, if that happened tomorrow, how would we use that to create jobs and businesses within our own communities, right? I think it would be a massive stimulus for every other community. And I don't think people have given that enough thought, right? So you have to prepare. You have to be in a position to be able to be ready for it, I think. So that's something else. To me, that's like the next stage, right?
Okay.
The first stage is, what can you do now to put yourself as an individual and as a family and as a community in a better economic situation and not be waiting on that, right? I'm not arguing the merits of it or not, but being prepared, right? And we're not prepared. And PhD helps you to do that because it creates the jobs that we're talking about. It creates the businesses. That's part of the infrastructure, both from a services standpoint, a product standpoint, and actually having like a financial industry that provides capital to businesses. Like all those things really need to be in place, and we need to be doing those things. We need to be doing those things now.
And as a community, as we spoke offline, we need personal financial management because without that, like you said, we're not going to be able to retain, even if we did get a stimulus package of that nature.
So we like don't even, let's put like stimulus package aside for now, right? And let's just talk about the importance of, when you go through the book, you see how resources were distributed in ways that led to massive economic deprivation for African Americans, right? For Black people in America. It's real, it's documented, it's been very, very devastating, right? You understand why that's the case. You also start to understand why we wouldn't have like a critical mass of knowledge that helps us to manage our resources better, right? And so that we could prepare for generational transfers and all those kinds of things. So one part of it is, as our incomes rise, we need to be able to retain more of it, right? Because it's the ability to retain that allows us to save, to eliminate debt, and to put money away for retirement. It's what we call legacy.
Legacy, that's
right?
CPR for the soul.
Right. So we start to get into that because what happens is, as your resources scale, your expenses scale also, right? And we don't want to do the same thing with 30,000 that we're doing with 300,000, right? We want to be able to retain more of that as opposed to just have our expenses go up along with it. And that's something else that we work on, right, which is called personal financial management. It's focused on this notion of stewardship, ownership, and legacy. How do I manage the limited resources, because they are limited and they are lower than we should have, in the best way possible to drive cash flow. And I can use that cash flow now to maximize my ownership of assets and eliminate debt, and make sure that I have resources available to me when I retire, resources available to pass on as an inheritance to your children's children, and also resources that are available to you to really take action when you see a need in your kind of daily walk, right? That's a systematic way of thinking, right?
That's a change, a fundamental change in your thinking.
Yeah.
I remember I had an older brother who was in the financial services industry and very excited about it, and he was also, as part of that, selling life insurance, whole life and term, and he went to my father many years ago and says, hey, Dad, you need a key man policy, a strong man policy. You have these younger kids who, aren't even college age yet, and if you put this in place, forbid something happened to you, at least you would be able to provide education and or housing, for those minor children. And his response, and I'm sad to say, was absolutely not. If I got $1 million worth of insurance, somebody's going to kill me. And that's the mind frame of the uneducated. And I'm not saying my father was uneducated, extremely educated man, but in terms of financial responsibility and management, we just don't. We don't have those resources.
Right. This isn't to cast blame or to point fingers at anyone. Where was I getting the information from? Like my mom didn't have it to share with me, right? She was trying to accumulate resources against all odds, right? So we historically, many things have happened that have prevented us from accumulating that information. So even with the limited stuff that we do, we could put ourselves in a far better position. So that's what we do. We want to be able to make sure that people can strengthen what we call the soul: stewardship, ownership, and legacy. It's about creating a legacy mindset, so that as you get more resources, you're saving more of your resources, you're investing more to fund the legacy, right? And once that becomes a mindset, we start to think about it in terms of, okay, well, how does this affect legacy? And that's what we need to interject. That's not in the curriculum. It's not in the K through 12. It's not in at university. It's not, you're not getting your job. The presumption is you're going to figure it out, or somebody's going to help you with it. You mentioned key man insurance. I'll be really brief on this, right? Like, I learned about that term in business school. I knew about insurance, but I didn't know about key man insurance, right? Because that's what investors will take out on really important people.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Right? So, and you're at business school and you don't know it. I mean, how do you expect someone who hasn't been blessed with the opportunity to do that same thing? So that's part of what the information that we disseminate. So part is, how do you have a stronger financial core, yourself and your family? And then how do we have a stronger cure for our community? And we do that through PhD.
Okay, we've got about a minute before we take our station break. That's a very important segment, so I don't want you to get in the middle of it and cut it off. But when we come back, I want you to pick up on that and let us know what the things that we have to do, the programs you have in place, and the lifelong learning that you have to go into in order to be most beneficial.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we'll be right back after this break. Where we left off, we were discussing PhD, and I'm not going to take any time. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so, previously we talked about some of the challenges of where we are right now, right? We talked about in terms of like black businesses and enterprises that have employees, that we're missing 1.4 million of those. We have 109,000 or so of them. They're about 4% of all black businesses, about 2.6 million of them. But that tiny 4% drives about 70% of the revenue. Super, super critical. We're missing 1.4 million of those. We're also missing, 6 million jobs in the broader African American community, right, associated with those businesses. And then on top of that, you have that our net worth is over $8 trillion less than it otherwise should be, right, relative to our population. So these are some massive gaps that we're dealing with. The issue becomes, what's a framework that we can use to start to close those gaps, right, and to invite others to work with us to close those gaps. And that framework is what I call PhD, which stands for Purchase, Hire, and Deposit, in ways that create jobs and create businesses and expand businesses in the black community. So when you think about the P in PhD, that's consumer spend. That's the money that you or I or our families might be spending. And as a people, we spend about 1.2 trillion, I think is the current numbers associated with black spend, right, in America. That's unfortunately only about 2% of that is on black enterprise. So the vast majority of it isn't. So small changes in those kinds of spends can create the demand for products and services, which creates the demand for hiring to be able to meet it, right? And also for the capital that goes along with it. When you talk about the P from a corporate standpoint or government standpoint or institutions, right? That's their supply chain spend. So the question becomes, are we represented in their supply chain spend? So from a government standpoint, the federal government spending, I think it's close to $600 billion a year. It's a massive amount.
Number.
That doesn't include state level spending, right? And then even at the municipality level, right? So they're buying products and services from businesses. To what extent are we represented in those supply chains? Super critical. They can create massive job creation associated with that if they're buying our products and services. And then when you start to get to the H, that's about hiring, right? Because companies spend a lot of money on their payroll. And the question is, are we represented on the payroll? And we tend to have very small representation on really critical industries, right? So if you think about technology, I think we're about 2% of the employees across.
That's when that 2% number keeps raising its head.
It keeps coming up again and again. When you talk about, like where we are in STEM and a bunch of different things, we kind of hover around these 2% spaces. When you think about financial services, particularly at the management levels, right, we tend to be around the 2%. In medical fields, so on and so forth. It keeps happening again and again, which means that we're not well represented on the payroll of these companies. And if you want to affect jobs and businesses in our community, we have to be better represented on both.
I have a question. With affirmative action being in place for the last 50 years, how can we still be fighting that battle, that 2% battle, when we've had legislation in place that's supposed to have corrected that?
Your discussion, so let's just start at the outcomes, right? The outcomes is where are we, right? Which is that we're at 2% levels. The starting point was we were not present in many of these places, right? I remember reading up until 1948, you had one black employee in the banking industry in New York that was above janitorial level, right? Wow. Yeah, so big deal. And so you're talking about people going from having no position or almost minuscule, non-measurable positions. So it feels like there's been massive change relative to zero or close to zero. The affirmative action has been under assault from the minute that it was passed, right, or put in place. It's associated with black people, but it's really like all groups, right, associated with that. So the impacts associated with affirmative action is not just going to black people, right? That's kind of elevating people in general who are seen as like non-white or non-white male in particular. And people never really get into the numbers associated with like who's actually benefiting most from those kind of programs. But if you look empirically at where we are, the impact is small. When you get into the post, civil rights era, you have massive changes and improvements for a small group of African Americans. The top 5 or maybe 10% that were able to go to universities that they couldn't go before, that were able to go to get jobs and good corporations and industries that they were excluded from before. But you have some pretty big offsets to that are happening, like the hollowing out of the black community with all of the influx of drugs, mass incarcerations, a whole host of things. Close to a million, black people, predominantly men, in jail at this point, earning zero income for families. So, when it comes to, affirmative action, I'll give you a couple of ways to look at it, right? And I don't really talk about affirmative action. I just talk about what is the spend level that you have to create jobs and businesses. I don't really care what you call it.
Okay.
So if people say, look, I think it's great that we use our supply chain to create more opportunities for businesses, right? Particularly businesses that we view as minority. I think that's phenomenal. Now, what you have to be careful with is that minority doesn't mean black, right?
Yes.
Minority typically is like a euphemism for not white male, or diversity and inclusion and things like that, right? And when you think about who that is, that's about 90% of people on planet Earth. So it takes you to a very general, non-specific solution for really, really specific problems. So if you said to yourself, in my supply chain, we're going to do more business with women entrepreneurs, right, and with women-owned businesses, which is wonderful and amazing and fantastic, and they should absolutely continue to do that. But if you look at that, and if you look at women-owned businesses, they generate about $1.2 trillion, the ones that have employees, which is great. But if you look at how many of those come from black women, it's less than 2%.
Exactly.
So when you look at what's happening, like specifically with black people in the spend, it's very, very small. And if you and when you start looking at the detail in that way, and you say, well, how much of that is actually going to black enterprise, the numbers are massively small.
In the last 5 minutes, we're going to touch on deposit, and I want you to touch on the money multiplier effect and how black women get affected in that equation. Yeah.
So PhDs purchase, hire, and deposit. The last letter is the D is deposit, and that is really talking about put money in like black enterprises, black financial institutions. Money where
your interest and your mouth is.
Because they're banks, right? And banks are set up to provide credit or loans. And they primarily loan to individuals, to businesses, right? Commerce. But they also lend to consumers, right? So people start businesses, expand businesses. People buy homes, right? Cars and things of that nature. There are very few, black banks. Actually, right now, only $4 out of every $10,000 is in a black financial institution in the U.S. banking system, right? And those banks don't have enough deposits that they can use to do the lending that they need.
And as you said, they have the same regulatory expense as every other large bank.
Right. So, and not enough, not close to the revenue, right? So, and these banks are closer to the community. They, it's all of the advantages of kind of like being a smaller community bank without the deposits associated with it. Now, black businesses are starved for capital, right? There's many studies that talk about that. And some estimates say that the existing businesses require up to about $9 billion of credit, right? Up to that much. And if they had access to more financing, they would actually do more hiring, right? And putting money in, black financial institutions allows them to have the capital to do it. It's really super critical. You talked about the money multiplier effect. And the idea behind that is if you have like a deep, well-functioning, depository system, that for every dollar you put in, minus what they have to keep for stability, called the Federal Reserve requirement, they can lend out 90 cents. And the person who gets the 90 cents will put it back in a bank, right? And then that bank can lend out,
And lend that out,
you know, so on
yes.
and so forth. And as you keep doing that, it winds up for every dollar you put in, it has a $10 effect. But for you to get that within a community, then the businesses and the people and the consumers actually have to be depositing in the institution. And we don't, right? So we're not getting that money multiplier effect, right? So it's a really, really, you know, important thing to have those institutions there, because their role is to provide financing for consumers and for businesses, right? And we are missing businesses, and we are starved for capital. And by the way, Black Americans have well over $100 billion in checking savings accounts, you know, across the country. So there's clearly enough money to be able to be put into Black institutions to provide the lending.
Okay. You know, our half hour, 28 minutes goes so fast, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap up right now. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing in about 30 seconds?
I'd say thank you for having me on the show. I think these are really important topics. Discrimination does exist. It does have a cost. That cost affects our ability to leave legacy for our children and their children. We care very deeply about that. The book lays out what those costs are. It proposes an economic framework to create jobs and businesses in our communities. And it's critical. And everyone can participate in that, right? And that's the way you should do it. If you're interested in that, you know, think about where you spend your money. Think about where you deposit.
Okay. All right, America. That was Shawn D. Rochester. Stay tuned for part 4, and we're going to tell you some quantitative things to do and some pragmatic ways to carry yourself to allow you to get to PhD. Thank you very much.